February 17, 1944. The pre-dawn air above the Truk Lagoon hung thick with tropical humidity. Salt spray carried on winds that whispered across coral atolls like the breath of sleeping gods. In the cockpits of their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, veteran pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat with the stillness of men who had already touched immortality. Their hands rested lightly on control sticks worn smooth by 1,000 combat sorties. Below them, the fortress of Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, spread across the lagoon like a constellation of military might. Cruisers, destroyers, supply ships, all nestled within the protection of barrier reefs, and the certainty that their mastery of the sky remained absolute. Then, from the east, came the sound. Not the high whine of aircraft engines they expected, but something deeper, heavier, a mechanical growl that rolled across the water like distant thunder. The Japanese pilots exchanged glances beneath their leather flight caps. They had heard intelligence reports about a new American carrier fighter, something called the F6F Hellcat. The reports had been dismissive, almost contemptuous. The Americans, it seemed, had abandoned elegance for brute force, traded the art of aerial combat for industrial barbarism. The Hellcat was heavy, they were told, lacking in grace. A farmer's tool sent to do a samurai's work. In those final moments before contact, more than one Japanese pilot permitted himself a thin smile. For 3 years, the Zero had been the undisputed emperor of Pacific skies. An aircraft so perfectly balanced between speed, maneuverability, and range that it had become synonymous with Japanese air superiority itself. When the war began in December 1941, American pilots had faced the Zero with aircraft woefully inadequate for the task. The Brewster Buffalo, the F4F Wildcat, machines that were outclassed in nearly every measurable category. The Zero could turn inside anything the Americans flew. It could climb faster, dive longer, and in the hands of Japan's elite naval aviators, men who had trained for years, who had honed their skills over the skies of China and practiced their craft until flying became as natural as breathing. It was a weapon of almost mythological lethality. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, over Guadalcanal, across the vast emptiness of the South Pacific, the Zero had written its legend in contrails and falling aircraft. Japanese pilots spoke of it with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. The Zero was not merely an airplane, it was an extension of Bushido itself. The warrior's code made manifest in aluminum and fabric. Light, responsive, honest, it rewarded skill and punished hesitation. To fly a Zero was to engage in a form of aerial poetry, each maneuver a verse, each victory a completed stanza. The Americans, with their heavy, armored aircraft, seemed to understand nothing of this philosophy. They built their fighters like they built everything else. Crude, excessive, wasteful. More armor, more guns, more engine, always more, never better. When intelligence officers first briefed Japanese squadrons about the Hellcat in late 1943, the descriptions were met with barely concealed amusement. The new American fighter weighed nearly 13,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Zero. It was powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that produced 2,000 horsepower, a power plant so large it seemed to belong on a bomber rather than a fighter. The aircraft was thick, bulbous, built around the engine rather than shaped by the wind. Where the Zero was a katana, all edge and purity of purpose, the Hellcat was a club, blunt, heavy, American. Japanese pilots, men who had spent years perfecting the art of dogfighting, men who could sense the shift of air pressure over their wings, and knew instinctively when an opponent was vulnerable, looked at the specifications and saw confirmation of everything they believed about their enemy. The Americans could not match Japanese skill, so they compensated with weight. They could not train pilots to the same level of expertise, so they surrounded them with armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks. They could not build aircraft that danced through the air, so they built aircraft that bludgeoned their way through combat. In ready rooms across Japanese-held islands, veteran pilots passed around grainy photographs of the Hellcat with commentary that mixed professional assessment with cultural superiority. The aircraft looked like exactly what it was, a product of American industrial excess, a machine designed by engineers who understood manufacturing but not warfare, built by a nation that confused quantity with quality. But the Americans had learned something in the blood-soaked skies over the Pacific, a lesson written in the wreckage of shot-down Wildcats and the names of pilots who would never return to their carriers. They had learned that they could not beat the Zero at its own game. They could not outturn it, could not match the years of training that Japanese pilots brought to combat, could not replicate the cultural framework that produced men willing to die for a principle rather than retreat from a fight. So they changed the game entirely. The Hellcat was not designed to dogfight Zeros in the traditional sense. It was designed to negate every advantage the Zero possessed, to transform aerial combat from an art form into a brutal mathematical equation where American strengths, industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical adaptability would overcome Japanese mastery of traditional fighter tactics. The Hellcat's massive engine gave it speed, not in the turn, but in the dive and climb. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered a weight of fire that could saw a Zero in half with a single burst. Its armor turned away 7.7mm rounds that would have been lethal to earlier American fighters. Its self-sealing fuel tanks meant pilots could take hits and keep flying, could make mistakes and survive them, could learn from combat rather than die in their first encounter with Japanese veterans. The thunder that rolled across Truk Lagoon that February morning was the sound of 53 Hellcats from Task Force 58. Aircraft launched from American carriers in what would become known as Operation Hailstone. The Japanese pilots who scrambled to meet them climbed through morning clouds with confidence forged in hundreds of successful engagements. They anticipated another battle like so many before. American fighters trying vainly to match Japanese maneuverability, their pilots predictable, their tactics textbook, their determination admirable but ultimately insufficient. The Hellcats did not turn to fight. They came in fast, diving from altitude with the weight of their massive engines behind them, slashing through Japanese formations before climbing back to the high perch of energy superiority. Zero pilots, accustomed to drawing opponents into turning contests where Japanese superiority was absolute, found themselves chasing aircraft that simply refused to engage on Japanese terms. The Hellcats would dive, fire, and climb away, using speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement. When Zeros tried to follow them up, the American fighters would level off at altitudes where their superior power-to-weight ratio at high speed gave them advantage, then turn the tables and become hunters rather than hunted. Japanese pilots who had spent years perfecting the art of the turning dogfight suddenly found that art rendered obsolete. The Hellcat pilot did not try to outturn the Zero. He outran it, outclimbed it, and outgunned it. He fought from positions of advantage and refused combat when disadvantaged. He survived the first encounter, and the second, and the third, until the cumulative experience of American squadrons began to match and then exceed the dwindling expertise of Japanese veterans. Over Truk, the mathematics of attrition revealed themselves with merciless clarity. The Americans lost 4 Hellcats. The Japanese lost 127 aircraft over 2 days, not just Zeros, but reconnaissance planes, bombers, seaplanes, anything that tried to contest American control of the air above the lagoon. The kill ratio was not merely lopsided, it was apocalyptic. For every Hellcat lost, more than 30 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. The sound of those engagements, the deep, steady hammer of 50 caliber machine guns firing in synchronized volleys, became a signature of American air power. Unlike the lighter, faster-firing weapons of the Zero, The Hellcat's guns delivered their message with a bass note finality. Each burst was not a spray of bullets seeking a target, but a concentrated stream of half-inch projectiles capable of tearing through airframes, shattering engines, and detonating fuel tanks. Japanese pilots who survived the initial encounters reported something that intelligence officers found difficult to believe. The Hellcats were not piloted by novices. The Americans had learned. They flew with discipline, maintained formation integrity, and executed tactics that suggested careful training and professional competence. The Green pilots of 1942 had been replaced by men who understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations, who fought within the envelope of the possible rather than attempting the heroic and suicidal. Throughout 1944, the pattern repeated itself across the Pacific with mechanical inevitability. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, the engagement Americans, pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats from the fast. Carrier Task Force met the largest concentration of Japanese naval aviation launched since Midway. Over 400 Japanese aircraft attacked the American fleet in waves that represented the accumulated air power of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. The Hellcats rose to meet them like a wall of industrial fury. By the end of the engagement, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, the majority falling to Hellcats that had perfected the tactics first-blooded over Truk. American losses numbered fewer than 30 aircraft. The kill ratio approached 10-1. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation suffered losses from which it would never recover. The Zero pilots who survived, and their numbers grew fewer with each engagement, no longer spoke of the Hellcat with contempt. They spoke of it with the grim respect accorded to an executioner. Efficient, merciless, unstoppable. The transformation was not merely tactical but philosophical. The Hellcat represented a fundamental shift in how America approached warfare, a rejection of the notion that individual warrior excellence could overcome systematic industrial and technological superiority. Where Japanese aviation culture celebrated the ace, the individual pilot whose skill elevated him above his peers, American aviation culture celebrated the squadron, the team, the system. Hellcat pilots were trained to fight as units, to cover each other's blind spots, to attack in coordinated sections where one pilot's dive would flush targets into his wingman's guns. The aircraft itself embodied this philosophy. It was designed for mass production. 12,275 Hellcats would eventually be built, each one rolling off assembly lines where women riveters and civilian engineers had replaced machinists called to war. It was designed for maintainability, with engines that could be replaced in hours rather than days, airframes that could absorb damage and return to service quickly. It was designed, above all, to be flown by the average pilot, trained to average competence, and still achieve superior results. The Zero required an artist. The Hellcat only required a competent professional. Japanese military culture, steeped in centuries of tradition that valorized individual martial excellence, could not adapt quickly enough to this new paradigm. Training programs that had produced the superb pilots of 1941 required years to complete, years Japan no longer possessed as the war ground through its middle stages. Replacements sent to frontline squadrons in 1944 had months of training rather than years. Hours in the cockpit counted in hundreds rather than thousands. They climbed into Zeros, still magnificent in their capabilities, and faced Hellcats flown by American pilots who had survived long enough to learn, who had the advantage of armor when they made mistakes, who could return from missions with battle damage that would have killed Japanese pilots in their unarmored, unsealed aircraft. The attrition spiral worked only one direction. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost represented irreplaceable expertise. Every American pilot lost was a tragedy, but not a strategic catastrophe. There were thousands more in training. Climbing into Hellcats that factories produced faster than Japan could shoot them down. The sound of those 650 caliber machine guns became more than a tactical signature. It became a symbol of American industrial democracy applied to warfare. Each round fired represented not merely ammunition, but the vast industrial base that could produce billions of bullets, the logistics network that could deliver them to carriers steaming thousands of miles from home, the economic system that could sustain such expenditure of material without strain. Japanese pilots, many of whom came from a nation where scarcity was a way of life, where every bullet was precious and every aircraft irreplaceable, faced opponents who could afford to fire thousands of rounds in a single mission, who could absorb aircraft losses that would have crippled Japanese squadrons, who could replace veteran pilots with competent novices and still maintain combat effectiveness. The Hellcat was abundance-made weapon, American productive capacity given wings and guns, and set loose in skies Japan had once controlled absolutely. By late 1944, Japanese pilots no longer laughed at the Hellcat. Many no longer lived to form opinions about it at all. The aircraft that had seemed clumsy and crude had systematically dismantled the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm, one engagement at a time, one squadron at a time, until Japanese carrier aviation, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carriers that survived lacked aircraft to fill their decks. The aircraft that remained lacked pilots trained to fly them effectively. The pilots who still lived knew they faced not merely superior technology, but a nation that could afford to perfect that technology, mass-produce it, and deploy it with a lavishness that bordered on the incomprehensible. In the final accounting, the Hellcat would be credited with 5,223 aerial victories against 270 losses in air combat, a kill ratio of 19.1, the highest of any American fighter aircraft in the war. But statistics, however impressive, cannot capture what those numbers meant. The end of Japanese air superiority, the shattering of an illusion, the brutal demonstration that industrial warfare would be won not by warrior spirit alone, but by the nation that could build more, supply more, and replace losses faster than they accumulated. The legacy of the Hellcat extended beyond mere victory statistics into the realm of strategic transformation. It proved that American industry, given the right design and sufficient resources, could produce weapons that compensated for experience with capability, that replaced art with efficiency, that won through systematic application of material superiority rather than individual excellence. It validated an approach to warfare that would define American military power for the remainder of the century. Not the pursuit of the perfect weapon for the perfect warrior, but the development of the good enough weapon that could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and employed by normally trained personnel to achieve superior results. The Hellcat was not beautiful in the aesthetic sense that the Zero was beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that a suspension bridge is beautiful, in the way that an assembly line is beautiful. A triumph of engineering pragmatism over romantic idealism, of systematic thought over artistic inspiration. When the last Japanese Zero fell from Pacific skies, when the last veteran pilot who had struck Pearl Harbor died in a combat he could no longer win, the transformation was complete. The age of the warrior artist, the pilot who was also poet, the fighter aircraft as expression of cultural values, that age ended with the sound of 650 caliber machine guns firing in perfect synchronization. What replaced it was something the Japanese military culture, for all its sophistication and tradition, had not anticipated: the industrialization of air combat, the reduction of aerial warfare to a problem of resources and production, of training time and replacement rates, of logistics networks and technological adaptation. The Hellcat did not merely defeat the Zero, it rendered the entire philosophy behind the Zero obsolete. It proved that in modern warfare, freedom's greatest weapon was not the warrior's skill, but the factory's output. Not the individual's courage, but the system's efficiency. not the perfection of the blade, but the abundance of the forge. In this new age, victory belonged not to those who fought most beautifully, but to those who fought most sustainably, who could absorb losses and return stronger, who measured success not in honor but in kill ratios, not in glory, but in aircraft carrier decks cleared for the next strike. The laughter of Japanese pilots over the clumsy American fighter had died somewhere over Truk Lagoon that February morning in 1944, replaced by silence, then by the grudging respect accorded to an opponent who had rewritten the rules of engagement, and finally by absence itself as the pilots who might have laughed ceased to exist. In the end, the Hellcat was exactly what it appeared to be. Not a fighter aircraft trying to be a Zero, but something else entirely. The herald of a new form of warfare, where abundance was strategy, where industrial capacity was tactics, and where the nation that could build fastest would inherit the sky.